totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Make sure you subscribe and follow the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We've got video segments from episodes on all the platforms. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. Matt Berenson is this episode's guest. The book is called Secret Stars, the Greatest Underdogs of the Rock and Roll Era. Get ready to discover some amazing musicians that flew under the radar. We'll explore the greatest underdogs in rock and roll history included in Berenson's book. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have. These bands and songwriters may not have received as much radio play or any radio play at all as their more famous counterparts, but their music and stories are just as incredible. And you're going to find out in just a minute when we talk to Matt Berenson. Over on the show notes page, you can find a playlist of the bands and artists that we cover in this episode. They are all taken from Matt's book. Before each chapter, he offers up a playlist for you to listen to while you're reading through the chapters. It's a phenomenal book. We're going to get to it all right now. Here is Matt Berenson. Hey, Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here.
Your first love is music, but you've had quite a career in the film industry. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in Hollywood?
Sure. I was born in Los Angeles, so I not in an entertainment family, though I'm not connected to anyone in the business, but I grew up around it, and certainly I had friends who were connected in one way or another. And I grew up, I had a detour of 6 years. I was living in Bethesda, Maryland with my family, but mostly grew up in LA. And when I was getting out of college in the summer of 1990, I knew I wanted to work in either film or music. And a friend persuaded me to go with film, oddly enough, because he said, if you wanted to work in music, you should have started scouting bands when you were 18. Why did you even go get a college degree? You know what I mean? Just like dive in. And I thought that was interesting and smart. And I was like, oh, good point. Like, I could have started 4 years ago. You don't really need a college degree to work in rock and roll. But in film, you actually kind of do. Not everybody has a college degree, but there's just tons and tons of reading involved, scripts and books. And so I tend to be college graduates. And so I was like, okay, let me see if I can get an entry-level job in entertainment. And I started in a mailroom at the old venerable William Morris Agency, which was one of the two biggest agencies in town when I started, and worked my way up, figured out after the first couple of years that I really wanted to be on the creative side of things, not on the deal-making side of things. So I started working for different producers, and one thing led to another. And by the time I started producing, about 8 or 9 years into my career, I produced a little high school comedy called Whatever It Takes, and then hit pay dirt with a comedy with Eddie Murphy called Daddy Daycare. And then I was sort of off to the races. I mean, one hit movie doesn't guarantee a career in Hollywood, but it did help. It definitely was the turning point where I was like, okay, I can do this. And for a while I was pigeonholed as a comedy producer and produced a number of comedies, but then I kind of crossed over into drama and what I would just call quality films for adults. I was running a company for a guy called Sidney Kimmel, and I produced a movie called Place Beyond the Pines with a group of other producers, with Bradley Cooper and Ryan Gosling. I bought the script that became Hell or High Water, which was nominated for Best Picture of the Year, actually, that I left that company. And that script was written by Taylor Sheridan, who's gone on to create Yellowstone and all of its spinoffs. So he was and then over the last 8 or 9 years since I was at that company, I've produced The Boy and its sequel, those horror films, and a movie called The Best of Enemies with Sam Rockwell and Taraji Henson, a bunch of things. So I'm basically a career film producer at this point, who then got bitten by the music bug again and realized, I need an outlet for this. And one
here we are.
Yeah, and here we are.
We were talking about this before we started recording. The Place Beyond the Pines from 2012 is one of my favorite movies ever, period. I love that movie. For those who haven't seen it that are listening now, please go see it, because it's It's so good.
Thank you, Eric. Look, it's definitely one of the films in my career for sure that I'm most proud to have been involved with. I mean, I'm, one of many, certainly the writer-director, Derek Cianfrance is really the author of that film and deserves most of the credit for how it turned out. I was running the financing entity that fully financed the film, Sidney Kimmel Entertainment, and had a lot to do with the casting and the cut and music
and what a
other
cast!
things.
What a cast!
Ryan Gosling.
Bradley Cooper, Eva Mendes, Ray Liotta, rest in peace.
Yeah,
yeah. Ben Mendelsohn, Rose Byrne. There's some the kid who plays the son of Bradley Cooper. Who is he?
Oh, Emery Cohen. He was a great discovery in the film for sure. And another Mahershala Ali was pretty new when Derek cast him in that role. He was still going by Mahershala Hashabaz Ali. Wow. And we asked him if he could shorten it for the poster. And since then, he's been Mahershala Ali, and has won Oscars. And he was in Green Book, and I think it was either won an Oscar or was nominated for that, and has had a big career. But it was an incredible cast, and Derek is the filmmaker is amazing with casting. The material was so strong. It was such an original and beautiful screenplay that every actor wanted to do it. It was a fun problem to have for sure.
Love that movie. Great movie, great performances. So let's get to your love of music. Your baptism by fire was literal, but also spiritual, as you write in your book. Can you tell the story about the Dead Kennedys concert?
Well, that's certainly, when I had the idea for this book and started working on it, you really do reflect on like how your musical journey began. Everybody who loves music, probably somewhere between the age of 10 and 13, falls in love with a certain band or certain albums, and it kind of goes from there. I was definitely 2 or 3 years into that journey. I was a huge, Clash and Elvis Costello, and even like big fan of Van Halen's first record. My taste was all over the place, but I loved U2's first album from when I was 12 years old. That was one of the first albums I got really obsessed with. And my older brother gets his driver's license at the age of 16, and I'm 13. And he invites me to go to the Dead Kennedys concert with him. I've never been to a concert in my life. I mean, this is a hardcore punk band from San Francisco. Yeah. I was into that album, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables. That was the album of theirs that I knew really well. And with some trepidation, I said, sure, I'll come with you to the Dead Kennedy show. I was probably, 5 feet 2 inches tall. I was, young, never been to a concert. And it was just one of the most incredible, intense experiences of my life up to that point, for sure. And really, still to this day, I mean, he was in the mosh pit with all the big kids, from let's say 16 to 25-year-olds or something. And I was probably the youngest person at the show and the smallest person at the show. And I was standing towards the back, and just sensory overload from the band and the wildness on stage and of the mosh pit. And then suddenly I start to smell like I couldn't even really identify it. It's a smell that I know now as burning hair. Little did I know it was my own hair. And somebody had thrown a lighted pack of matches from this like stairwell that runs up the back of the whiskey, and it had landed on my head, and my hair caught on fire. So I literally was on fire at the Dead Kennedys concert. God. The people around me started backing away, freaking out. I just swatted at the top of my head, and I saw that the reason I knew it was a pack of matches is it fell on the floor, and I saw what it was, and I stamped it out. And, as soon as I knew I wasn't too hurt, I mean, my head was a little burned, but nothing that like required 911 or anything.
Yeah.
So
what could have happened?
It could have been it could have been my last concert.
There would be no The Place Beyond the Pines.
There would be no Place Beyond the Pines. There'd be no Secret Stars, the Greatest Underdogs in the rock and roll era. My children wouldn't exist. It could have been a very bad concert experience for me. But instead it really was just, I have many years later, and I'll try not to get emotional talking about this. I'm kind of an emotional guy, and this is the kind of thing that gets me emotional. But for my 50th birthday, my older brother found a photograph from that show, a famous photograph from the Dead Kennedys concert we were at, and had it blown up and framed, and I have it hanging on the wall in my office.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. So I have a picture from that show, and it's just nuts.
From that point on, you're in now. That's the moment. You're like, I am a fan of this music, rock and roll, this
The
beautiful.
literal and figurative baptism by fire.
Right.
That's what it was. And I was, I've been all in ever since, 40 years of just increasingly intense obsession with so many bands and songwriters across all different genres, but really mainly rock and all of the various things that came about from like 1954 to the present. I'm not like a huge blues or jazz or orchestral classical music guy. It really is more contemporary music. And it's just, I'm at least as obsessed with it as I am with film.
It's so true. Once you experience that high from whether it's a concert or for me, it was listening to an album. It was Van Halen's 5150, and you're chasing that high from that point on. And that's a great high. That's a lot better than drugs or alcohol. Rock and roll is a good high.
I agree. For me, I've never really found the downside. It's possible, because I don't wear earplugs when I go to shows, it's possible it'll only cost me on the hearing end of the spectrum as I get older. But for otherwise, no downside that I can see. Yeah.
So what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it was two things, really. The pandemic gave me a lot of time to reflect, and I had the idea for this book 6 weeks into lockdown. So, mid-March, we're all locked down, right? And as a film producer, I knew that for the foreseeable future, I was not going to be able to go away and produce a movie or even sell anything to I couldn't really do my job for quite a while, like a lot of people in the country. And like a lot of people who couldn't work during that time, I was starting to get anxious 2, 3, 4 weeks into it. And I was also listening to a lot of music. And so the other thing that happened was my obsession with Robert Pollard and his band Guided by Voices, who, I'm sure we'll talk about, because he's chapter 9 of the book, had just reached a fever pitch. I had been a fan from their breakout album in 1994, B-1000, and had seen them live during those years. But I had sort of forgotten about them in the mid-2000s, like a lot of people, and then rediscovered them in like 2017 when he formed with a new lineup. And they've made like 14 albums together now. Anyway, I was just getting super, super into him and them and realizing how vast his body of work was. And I just started to think, like, how is this guy not widely considered like one of the greats of all time? It was just obvious to me that he was. And I thought, is there, who else is like that? Are there other, and I started to make a list of like, who are some of the songwriters and bands who I think are among the greatest of all time, but who aren't widely regarded as such. And then I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, has anybody written a book about that? Like about sort of underdog artists, underappreciated songwriters and bands who deserve sort of more attention or success than they've had? And I, just did a quick Google search and I couldn't find anything like it. The closest thing to it was a book I already had read and loved called Our Band Could Be Your Life by Michael Azerrad, huge, rock critic and writer. And that's, his biggest book. He wrote about 13 artists in that book, and they were all from a kind of certain underground punk DIY scene of the 80s, and some of them got bigger in the 90s. But it was sort of about a whole music scene, that book. And my book's different than that. When I had this idea, I thought, oh, that's just a relevant comp for my book because it was successful and fans of the artists in that book, like it was a hit book. So I knew that I was onto something. I knew that my idea to write about the 10 greatest, bands and songwriters of the rock era who people don't already know, or who didn't have any big hits, weren't played on the radio, or maybe they had one medium-sized hit, but no big hits. I thought, I got to write this. I couldn't shake the idea. And I'm like, I'll never get another chance. When is there going to be another pandemic? Or I could wait till I'm retired, but that's too late. so it was sort of a carpe diem thing. Like I got to start doing research and seeing, I wasn't sure at first that it was going to be 10. I thought maybe I'd write about 12 or 13 artists in tribute to Azerrad, or, one thing led to another. And I wasn't even sure I was going to finish it until I got at least halfway into it and really figured out what it was. And then I was just loving it. It was hard work, but I was like, oh God, this is going to take me a long time. And it did. It took me 2.5 years on and off.
So before we get to the artists who make the book, can you talk about the 5 main criteria you use to choose the artists?
Yeah, that was something that, simultaneous to figuring out what artists I wanted to write about, I thought, well, how do I made a list that had about somewhere between 30 and 50 bands on it. I can't believe I didn't.
That's what I was going to ask you. Yeah. How many were left off? Which ones were left off?
Yeah, I didn't save my original list, but I know who a lot of the other artists were who I almost chose to write about. And I was trying to figure out a way to narrow it down, really. And the way I narrowed it down was to come up with the following criteria. They had to be artists I truly love, not where I love their body of work, not just a single album, not just, it wasn't something that I loved back in high school, but don't love anymore. It had to be like an artist that's really one of my favorites, full stop, even though they're not the Beatles or the Who or REM or any number of huge, I'm a big Prince fan. I'm a big fan of lots of huge successful artists. But there are a lot of, lesser known artists that I love just as much. And so that was one I had to truly love them. They had to be artists who only play smaller venues unless they're playing at festivals or opening for a bigger band or something. When they're on their own, when they're the headlining act, they had to be, they play clubs. They either never had songs on the radio or never any big hits. They could have one moderate hit, but no big hits. Any band that had a platinum album or a top 10 hit was too big for the book. That allowed me to narrow it down a little bit. And then what else? Oh, I actually left out, in a weird way, the most important one that enabled me to narrow it down the most, which was I had to know, either through some research, which helped me narrow it down, or just off the top of my head, that they had a great story. Because part of this for me was marrying my love of storytelling, which is one of the reasons I produce films, to my love of music. And that's really what writing a music book is. It's music and storytelling combined. And there are plenty of really talented artists whose stories are, everybody's story is interesting to one degree or another, but the artists I wrote about have really interesting stories in ways that I'm sure we'll cover, as we start to talk about them. I mean, two of the artists I wrote about crossed paths with Charles Manson.
Yeah.
That's pretty weird. And I didn't even know that. I didn't know that when I started. Like, I don't think I knew it in either artist's case. And I think, we'll be talking about both of these artists and what their intersection was with the Manson family.
Yeah, but, the arc of their careers, or the particular, maybe if it's a particular member of the band, they do have these stories that are, some of them are tragic, some of them have good endings.
Yeah, and one of them was friends with Jeffrey Dahmer when he was a kid. One of the artists I wrote about. I didn't know that when I knew other things about him, but as I started to dig into his story, I'm like, what? He was in the band. They were in band in elementary school together. This is Joe Henry I'm talking about now, who's chapter, 7 in the book. He was friends with Jeffrey Dahmer when he was a kid. How weird is that?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of other interesting things about his story. That's one of many interests. He's married to Madonna's sister. He was in a play with Madonna in high school.
But one of the 10 artists to make the book is a band that I remember hearing about. I think it was in 2006, because this is when they had the concert. They had a tribute concert to Arthur Lee of Love. Robert Plant was going to be there. And This is back in my radio days. And I remember the thing came across on our daily music information sheet. And I said, Love, Arthur Lee. But I'm thinking, if Robert Plant's there, and then they named the other artists there, I'm like, it's got to be good. But I'm ashamed to say I didn't really invest any time into it. And FM Rock Radio never played this band, at least during my time, but there might have been that one song, what, 7 and 7 is.
7 and 7 is you wouldn't have heard growing up, and I didn't either. In the 60s, it was a modest hit. The one thing you might have, you're younger than I am, but I was a teenager in the 80s, and there was a band that covered the first song on Love's third album, Forever Changes, the song Alone Again, that got played on the radio a fair amount, but it wasn't even Love's version that was getting played on the radio. It was some band. I actually can't even remember what band it was. I mentioned it in the book, but
right.
I forget who they were.
Forgetting too.
Love and Rockets. No.
It
was an LA band. I think
yeah.
It was a local LA band, and they did a good cover of it. And that was the only Love song I ever heard on the radio.
What's great about this too, you have a playlist. You set up each chapter with a playlist to start.
Yep.
So, and all the artists that I ask you about in this episode, everybody can find your playlist. I just put it onto.
Oh, how great. Thank you.
So people can listen to it. When did you first discover Love? When was the first time you heard him?
Okay. So this is, to me, it's a great story because it's just so nerdy. I mean, it's just so music nerdy, and it's exactly the way, I find my way to a lot of these artists. In fact, wow, it's amazing how many in the book, now that I think about it, I probably found my way to them in a similar way. I'm a big fan of a UK songwriter named Lloyd Cole. Have you ever heard of Lloyd Cole and the Commotions?
No.
So okay.
Never heard of him.
He was also on my short list for this book. And if there's ever a Secret Stars 2, for sure, he will be in it. He's an all-time favorite of mine. I used to think he was a Scottish songwriter, but he really grew up right on the bubble of like Northern England and Scotland. He's not technically Scottish, but a lot of the other guys in the Commotions were. So they were kind of a Scottish band, kind of not. Anyway, he has a fantastic song on his first album, Rattlesnakes, which is considered a classic by a lot of people. It's one of my favorite albums of the 80s, honestly. Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, Rattlesnakes, their first album. The last song on it is called Are You Ready to Be Heartbroken? And in it, there's a line where he says, listening to Arthur Lee records, letting your friends know you feel guilty about their cynicism and the rest of their generation. He just tosses out the name Arthur Lee records. And I'm like, I've never heard of Arthur Lee records. And you look up, there are no Arthur Lee records. There's one Arthur Lee solo album. But I'm like, what is he talking about? Who is Arthur Lee? Well, there was no internet in 1984. So I literally just had to start asking around other music nerd friends of mine, older people. Have you ever heard of Arthur Lee? Who's Arthur Lee? And I found out he was the singer-songwriter of the band Love, which was the first integrated rock band, sort of. Booker T and the MGs was an integrated band, but they were really the house band for Stax. They did have a hit with the instrumental Green Onions, but they weren't and they did have an album out off the success of the hit Green Onions. But Love was a rock band the way you think of a rock band. They put out albums, they played shows, they have, had lyrics to their songs that, they were not a house band for anyone else. They were their own thing, LA band. And when I heard, basically, once I found out about them, I heard their album Forever Changes. Their third album was sort of the album they were famous for, and that some people considered among the greatest albums of all time. And
Library of Congress has it on their list, right? Library of Congress. There
we go. It turns out, if you look at almost any list from the 20th century of the greatest rock albums of all time, it'll be there. Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time from I think it was the year 2003, the first one they did. Forever Changes is 150 on the list. It's way up there. And in the UK, it's much bigger than it is here. Any list of the greatest albums of all time in any UK music magazine will include Love's Forever Changes. So they are bigger there and better known in the UK than they are here. But they never had any. They had one top 40 hit here, minor hit called, two, but really not huge hits at all. One was a cover of a Burt Bacharach song called My Little Red Book, which is fantastic. Their version of it is so much better than his. And then a song called 7 and 7 Is, which I was actually surprised was their biggest hit here because it's very punk. It sounds like a really aggro really early punk song because it was 1966. They were way ahead of the curve. And I just fell in love with all of it. Their first three albums, which are the three that with the original lineup, And then really he recorded several great albums as Love after that, but not as great as those three. The fourth album and last one for Elektra is also really good, called For Sale, which is a little inside joke Arthur had, Love for Sale, like
Right.
even though he spelled it Foursail.
But this was an LA band, right? This is
Yes, LA band.
late 60s.
Yeah. I wanted to start the book in the 60s. I wanted to kind of grow. This is actually I'm glad you just said 60s, because it's important to say the book is chronological. I start in the 60s with my favorite overlooked rock band of the 60s, which for me in the UK or US or Australia or anywhere, I chose Love. And I think it really is because they're the most important, for sure. Objectively, I argue in my book, they are the most important band from the 60s that most people don't know. Why is that? Well, the first song Jimi Hendrix ever played guitar on was written by Arthur Lee. And it was recorded by a female artist before Love existed, even when Arthur was a teenager. He wrote a song when he was 19 that was recorded by Anita Billings. No, wait, that was his girlfriend. That was his girlfriend at the time. I can't remember the name of the artist who recorded it, but she recorded an Arthur Lee song that Jimi Hendrix was the guitarist on when he wasn't even calling himself Jimi Hendrix yet. He and Arthur met each other then and remained friends for the rest of Jimmy's life. And I tracked that friendship through the whole chapter, as you know. So Arthur Lee starts an integrated rock band, and wouldn't you know, so does Jimi Hendrix. So Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone were the first famous integrated rock bands, or in the case of Sly and the Family Stone, R&B, soul. But, Jimi Hendrix learned a lot from Arthur Lee. That's all I can tell you. Love's guitar player, Johnny Eccles, used to play the guitar behind his head.
Yeah.
So Jimi Hendrix was around. Before the Jimi Hendrix experience, there was Love. That's all I can say. So that's one reason. Another reason is, the Rolling Stones were huge fans of Arthur Lee's.
Yeah, tell me about this. They pay homage to him in the song She's a Rainbow? How so?
Yes. So She's a Rainbow, which came out a year after Love broke up. The original lineup of Love broke up. Arthur was still making albums as Love at the time. The chorus of that song, as you know from the big commercial that it was used in a few years ago during the pandemic, that song, a lot of people didn't even know the Rolling Stones song, She's a Rainbow, but it became a huge, well-known song of theirs during the pandemic because it was on a national commercial that ran constantly. And the chorus of it is, she comes in colors everywhere, she combs her hair, she's like a rainbow. Well, Love has a great song, one of their best songs, called She Comes in Colors. And there is no way, in fact, wow. I know for sure the one of the members of the Rolling Stones acknowledged that they were a huge fan of that Love album and listened to it all the time. Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd was a huge fan of that album and listened to it all the time. Joe Boyd, who produced the first two Pink Floyd singles, he said that Syd Barrett told him how influential the first Love album was on the early Pink Floyd sound. He told Joe that personally, and Joe told me that when I was interviewing him for a different chapter in the book, because Joe Boyd worked with two of the artists in my book. He worked with Nick Drake, chapter 2 of my book. He produced all the Nick Drake albums, and he also worked with Robin Hitchcock, who's chapter 4 in my book. So I learned that from him. I didn't even know. So, I mean, that's pretty to influence Jimi Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, and Pink Floyd, and like nobody knows this band. That's
so
nuts.
Well, so why then? Why is it that Love didn't go on to become the Doors or the Stones or Hendrix?
Well, in my research, I discovered the big reason was, and certainly this was well known among other people who have written about Love, the idea that one of Arthur Lee's big problems was he didn't like to tour. He only played shows up and down the coast of California, a lot of San Francisco, LA shows where he had a rabid fan base. And he would go to New York occasionally and play some shows in like New York and New Jersey. And so there was a little following there. He was not willing. He was very nervous being of mixed race himself and being in a sort of mixed race band about touring the South, even though Jimi Hendrix would do it a couple of years later successfully. He was just He was nervous about that. And what I learned in my research that did not appear anywhere else in my research, there's no other book about love or article that you'll ever find. When I interviewed Johnny Eccles, who's still alive, who was the guitarist of Love, the guitarist on their first 3 albums, their classic albums, he was friends with Arthur from high school, from before high school, because they lived 2 doors down from each other in LA, and they had both been born in Memphis, and their mothers knew each other and all of that. He revealed to me for the first time, he had never revealed it in an interview. I have no idea why he told me that Arthur was diagnosed as bipolar in his teens. He shot out a friend's eye by accident with a BB gun. He meant to shoot him with a BB gun. He didn't mean to shoot out his eye. And he was diagnosed as bipolar and went on medication and was on bipolar medication while he was in, writing and recording all of his incredible songs. A lot of amazing songwriters were bipolar. Jimi Hendrix has the famous song Manic Depression. Manic Depression is what they called it back when Hendrix wrote that song, but now technically it's called bipolar disorder now.
Okay.
It used to be called Manic Depression, yeah. So that's the other answer to your question. He struggled with bipolar, which led him to various kinds of drug and alcohol addiction. He would shut himself away in his house for weeks at a time. I think he didn't tour because he was bipolar. He was very uncomfortable being out he was either super, super comfortable, by the way Manic Depression works. When you have manic episodes, you can be around other people. You can get up on stage and perform. You can, write a whole album's worth of songs in a weekend. But when you're depressed, you're depressed and you shut yourself away and you can't be around other people. And I think that's really why they didn't become bigger. I think he had crippling bipolar.
Well, this is hands down my favorite of the 10 artists that you cover in this book.
I love
hands
that.
down my favorite. And Arthur Lee, he died in 2006, right?
Yes, he died in 2006 of leukemia. Sadly, before I ever got to see him, after serving some time in prison. I mean, there's so much to the story I could get into, but rather than doing that, let me thank you for saying that sort of this was a band you didn't know that you discovered from the book that you now love. That was the purpose for me of writing the book. My number one goal, aside from telling entertaining stories in each case and trying to shine a light on these artists and hopefully make them more popular than they are, hopefully a bigger part of the kind of pantheon that stands the test of time. Some of these artists have already stood the test of time. Nick Drake got big in the 90s in a way that he never was in the 70s and 80s. Big Star, who chapter 3 in the book, nobody knew about them until, they're my second on the list. Big Star's second for me. Sure. Oh, okay. Good.
It's like going into a record store and the record store owners, they'll play music that they love and they want the people to hear it. And it's like you walk into a record store and you're like, who's this that I'm listening to? And then you ask the owner, this is so-and-so. And then you're like, man, I like these guys. That's what it feels like reading this book. That's
well, that is the highest compliment you could have paid me, because that was first of all, I spent more time in record stores growing up than almost anyone I know, and I miss them terribly. I still go occasionally, even if I'm not going to just to walk around, because I just love that. And occasionally they will be playing something that I don't know, and I'll go ask. And that's how I discovered a lot of great music. And that's what I want this book to be for music fans. If you're a music fan, you already know. You don't need to read another book about the Beatles or David Bowie or Prince, or you already know, the Rolling Stones, or, we could go on and on. There's maybe 100 artists that everyone knows. They know their music. And I didn't feel like I needed to write a book about any of those, but to turn music fans onto music that I think they like as much as their favorite artists is fun for me. I mean, that was a big part of it for me.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Matt Berenson is the author of Secret Stars, the Greatest Underdogs of the Rock and Roll Era. Another to make the book is Big Star. So much promise, so much talent, yet so much tragedy. When did you first find out about Big Star?
Similar to that Lloyd Cole and the Commotion song, Are You Ready to Be Heartbroken, that referenced Arthur Lee, the Bangles, their biggest hit album in the 80s that had I was going to say it's the same one that has Prince's Manic Monday and Walk Like an Egyptian.
The
I
Flame,
believe
that
that
one.
same album has a cover of Big Star's September Girls.
Okay.
And it was my favorite song on that Bangles record. I loved the Prince song. I loved, a lot, and they also had a lot of originals, their own originals on that album. So I heard the song September Girls, which I still think is one of the best power pop songs ever written. It's top 10 for me. And power pop is a large category of music, obviously. And I am planting my flag that that's a top 10 power pop song of all time, up there with, Cheap Trick, Surrender. And I could probably name the other 8 that would be in my top 10. And I was like, Alex Chilton, who's that? Because it said in the liner notes, written by Alex Chilton. That led me on a search, led me to Big Star. It was very hard to even find the Big Star albums at the time. I actually didn't own them all, and there are only 3, until they were reissued by Rykodisc in the early 90s. And that's when I got obsessed with them. By the way, after the Bangles covered September Girls, the Replacements, who were one of my favorite bands of the 80s, had a song called Alex Chilton that was the single off their album Pleased to Meet Me, which a lot of people think is the best Replacements album.
Yeah.
So they had a whole tribute to Alex Chilton on there. And I had already known about him because of the song September Girls. And I'm like, why do all my favorite bands like this guy? Which is something I discovered in writing this book. And in the artists I chose, it's not a coincidence. It's a happy accident that the artists I chose all are revered by other more successful bands and artists. It's almost like they're your favorite songwriter's favorite songwriter. You know what I mean? And so Alex Chilton was one of the 2 songwriters of Big Star. The other one was Chris Bell. They made the first album together. And then Chris was not on the second 2 Big Star albums, although he kind of was, and a lot of people don't know it.
And both of them vocalist guitarists.
Yes, both vocalist, guitarists, and songwriters. So that's how I found out about them. They're a Memphis band from the 70s. Unbelievable story. Alex Chilton, at the age of 16, was chosen to be the lead singer of the band The Box Tops. And their first single, The Letter, was the second biggest song of 1967. It not only was a #1 hit, it was a #1 hit for 8 consecutive weeks and was the second biggest song of that entire year in the United States. In 1967, in the United States, The Letter by the Box Tops, which Alex Chilton is the singer on. He didn't write it. He's the singer on it. Dan Penn wrote it. Alex Chilton, by the time, I think right around the age of 17, when the song blew up, the Box Tops were opening for the Beach Boys in stadiums in front of 20,000 people. One of the incredible things I learned about Alex Chilton in the process of this is he became friends with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. He went to stay with them out in LA after the Box Tops tours end. And one night when he was over at Dennis Wilson's house, the Manson family came over to party. And he met Charles Manson and a bunch of, the people who would later wind up in prison for the horrific, murders.
Wow.
And he was the only artist in my book to cross paths.
One of many artists that came and went through that house, Dennis's house. Yeah.
Yes,
Neil Young,
exactly.
Stephen Stills.
Yeah. And look, Arthur Lee crossed paths with Bobby Beausoleil from the Manson family, who's still alive and in prison for not the Sharon Tate murders and the famous Manson murders. He killed one of the members of the Manson family.
Yeah.
He killed one of the and is in prison for a separate murder before the bigger murders were committed. And he was in Arthur Lee's band for a couple of weeks, but he was kicked out of the band for being unreliable. Bobby Beausoleil. Yeah, go figure.
Yeah.
So anyway, Alex Chilton leaves the Box Tops, thinks he's going to go solo, moves to New York, had already had a child, left his wife, moved to New York. So, this guy, by the time he was 21 years old, was a rock star, married and divorced with a child, and had started to write songs on his own. Chris Bell and Andy Hummel, who went to college together in Memphis, were starting a band, and Chris knew that Alex was no longer into the Box Tops and went to chase him down to start a band together. And they met in New York and they played each other their songs. And Alex was really impressed by the songs that Chris played him. And Alex played Chris songs that blew him away. And they met up in Memphis and decided to start a band together. And they were halfway through recording the first album before they had even picked the name of the band. And they called themselves Big Star because there was a grocery store across the street from the studio in Memphis called Big Star Groceries. How cool
the
is that?
end of this story ties into that grocery store.
Yes, it does. So the tragedy of Big Star, there's so many tragic things about Big Star. I mean, one is that they sold, they made 3 of the greatest albums of all time. If you look on any list of the greatest albums of all time, it will have at least one Big Star album on it, if not all 3. And yet a lot of people don't know these records. So tragically, it led to, fighting within the band and Chris leaving the band early. And, they just didn't get discovered till later and didn't really have much, if any success, certainly no success while the band was together. The other tragedy was Chris Bell struggled with depression. He recorded one solo album, or really it was a bunch of songs over time that was eventually put together as an album. But when he was 27 years old, like so many famous rock stars, he died. He was back home living with his parents, struggling with depression, working at a grocery store, bagging groceries, and drove into a light pole. He was speeding, I guess, smashed into a light pole, which fell on his car and killed him, on the way home. So he never knew that he was just about, like, in the 80s, Big Star started to get a lot of attention and every band was talking about them and writing about them. The biggest Big Star fans there are is REM. I mean, they're the biggest. Right. They do covers of Big Star songs. Everybody covers Big Star songs. Elliott Smith, who I write about in the book, does a great cover of the song 13. But boy, Mike Mills of REM did their induction ceremony, not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because you won't find Big Star in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame where they belong, because they influenced so many artists. They're one of the most influential bands. In this case, Big Star didn't make it. The number one reason, because I try to explore in each chapter of the book, one of the things I try to explore is why they didn't make it bigger. Because I make the case for they should have been bigger, so then I have to explain why they weren't, right? And in Big Star's case, the biggest reason was things kept getting screwed up with the distribution of their albums, their record deals. At first they had a deal with Stax, who had a deal with Atlantic, and they thought, wow, our record's going to be in record stores around the country. But then the guy who made the deal with Stax got fired from Atlantic or Columbia, and so then the deal with Stax got canceled, and Stax didn't have very good distribution themselves. So people who were reading great reviews of the Big Star album couldn't even find it in the store.
Yeah,
They had to call Ardent Records, who had made the deal with Stax, and where the Ardent Studios is where they recorded their music in Memphis, to get them to mail order albums. So, I mean, their first album might have been a hit if it had been promoted properly and distributed properly. And then there might have been a very different outcome for the band.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. There are more than a few artists on this list who battle depression. Did you find that to be consistent in the 10 artists you write about? Did you find any other similarities in the 10 artists that stood out to you?
I would say 4 of the 10 artists, there was definitely depression for sure. Arthur Lee, in his case, manic depression or bipolar disorder. Nick Drake definitely struggled with depression. Chris Bell and Big Star, and then Elliott Smith ultimately committed suicide, who's probably the most successful artist I wrote about. I can't, I don't know if we'll, end up talking about him or not, but he.
Yeah, just briefly talk about Elliott Smith.
Sure. Yeah. So he's the other one who struggled with real depression. His story, he's just, like a Beatles level songwriter, an unbelievably talented songwriter who's also, I would say, maybe even the second most influential artist in the book. Almost any important artist in the last 5 to 10 years points to Elliott Smith as like the biggest influence on their work. I mean, Phoebe Bridgers and and Adrian Lenker from Big Thief, and a lot of current artists now are like, oh, he was the guy. He was the guy for me who lit my flame, kind of. And he, he's a guy I discovered from the movie Good Will Hunting. I don't know if you know the Matt Damon Ben Affleck movie.
Yeah.
Almost all the songs in that are Elliott Smith songs.
Oh, really?
Gus Van Sant was living in Portland at the time, and Elliott Smith was a kind of local celebrity songwriter in Portland. Had a couple albums out, and Gus Van Sant went to see him play and met him and said, I'd really like to use some of your songs from your upcoming album in my movie. I think it's a beautiful album. His album Either Or, which I think is one of the great albums of the 90s, really one of my absolute favorites of the 90s. There are like 5 songs from that album in Good Will Hunting. And then he also wrote an original song for Good Will Hunting that he was Oscar nominated for, called Miss Misery. So you'd think that would almost make him too big to be a secret star, but he never had a hit. He never had a gold album. You had never heard his music before. I mean, you didn't know him before reading my book. A lot of people have maybe heard his name, but don't know about him. Gus Van Sant deserves a lot of credit for what he did in Good Will. I mean, the movie's great, but part of what's great about it is he chose this secret star, this person he knew was a really special artist that no one knew about yet.
Much like the character.
Yes, exactly. And character. Essentially, it's like wall-to-wall Elliott Smith songs, that movie. And then Paul Thomas Anderson did the same thing in Magnolia with Amy Mann's music. And I compare Elliott Smith and Amy Mann. They actually have a lot of things in common that I talk about in the book. But Elliott Smith was one of the first artists who was used that way in a movie. Although I guess really the first movie to do that was The Graduate with Simon and Garfunkel's music. That's the first one I can think of that sort of, Simon and Garfunkel, they had already become famous just before The Graduate came out, but The Graduate sort of made them huge and used their music to great effect. So mental illness is one of the things that some of the artists had in common, but not all of them. I mean, 6 of the 10 artists, no. But I would say the one thing that's true of all of them is that they had some kind of trauma or something in their lives, whether it was mental illness or something else, that made them turn inward and become an artist in the first place. I think most really, really talented artists have something. If you dig deep enough, you'll find something. Even the one artist, Joe Henry, denied he had anything like that. This is the one who was friends with Jeffrey Dahmer in elementary school. Not that that's traumatic. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't a serial killer yet. It's interesting. I asked Joe Henry this question of, do you think an artist needs to be, that all artists are tortured in some way or have something that makes them turn inward? And he categorically denied that. He thinks the tortured artist idea, that artists who do struggle with really serious issues, that it actually gets in the way of the work rather than making the work better. But I don't know that he denied that there was something that made him turn inward, but he sort of denied that in his case. I mean, he's very close with his brother. He had very loving family, super close with his mom and dad. Very, good upbringing, stable upbringing, didn't grow up in poverty, nothing like that. His father was a senior executive in Detroit for an auto company. But he also told me that he had a profound stutter as a child. He was super shy. They moved around a lot before they settled in Detroit, so he had a hard time making friends. So, I mean, that sounds to me like you understand why he turned inward and started to just get obsessed with records at an even earlier age than I did, and got, obsessed with becoming a talented musician. And so what they all have in common, and they all have their own story and different thing, except in the case of, where I would say mental illness was the thing in the case of 4 of the artists. The other 6 had different things that made them kind of turn inward and become artists, I think. Right. And that's something that was interesting for me to discover.
So let's finish with one more, because it is Robert Pollard and Guided by Voices. We cannot leave them out because you're wearing the shirt right now. So I would be in trouble if we didn't mention him. Yeah,
we absolutely cannot leave them out, because as I told you earlier, that was really the artist that inspired the book and made me start to create a list. And he's the ultimate secret star in a way for me. But go ahead and
well, no, you list some of the sometimes downright astonishing things about the self-described scientist, robot boy, and pop Zeus. Can you share some of your favorites? I could see that he could have had a career as an athlete. That's one really cool.
There are so many. I mean, his story is as interesting, at least. I'm not going to say he's the most interesting story in the book, but he is one of the best rock and roll stories. I mean, he's up there with anybody's story. I mean, this is a guy who taught math to fourth graders for 14 years from the age of 22 to 36 before he got a record deal.
I mean,
so just
that's ancient in rock and roll years, 36 years old.
Ancient in rock and roll years, right? Nobody knew who he was really till he was 37. I didn't hear of him till he was 37. And that's pretty late. And a lot of people didn't know that's how old he was. But then when you went to see them live, you were kind of like, that guy doesn't look like a 25-year-old. Like, that's interesting. And then you start to read articles. So one of the amazing things about him is he was a math teacher for 14 years before anybody discovered him. He was a math teacher for 4 years before he recorded his first EP. So nobody even could have discovered him for let's say 5 years. The first Guided by Voices album was in 1987. Nobody knew of them. He was selling them out of his trunk. I mean, he didn't have a record deal. So he made his first 5 albums before he was even signed to a little indie label on his 5th album, Propeller. But just in terms of all the amazing things about him, I mean, this is a guy who has recorded 37 or 38, depending on how you count, albums as Guided by Voices, and probably as many EPs with totally independent, with another couple hundred songs on them. He's recorded another 75 albums, not as Guided by Voices, 25 as himself, as Robert Pollard, 15 with a band called the Circus Devils, 5 with a band called Boston Spaceships. So for fans, it's a bottomless pit of just incredible music. I mean, not all of it's great. Not every Guided by Voices record is great, but he's written and recorded and released more songs than any other songwriter in history, over 3,000. Over 3,000 that are available right now for streaming. And that doesn't even count maybe another 500 that aren't available for streaming, that are just B-sides to singles that have just never been added to streaming, some of which I've never heard, which is painful for me. I'm very eager to hear them.
Yeah.
So among the extraordinary things about him are most albums and most songs of any artist ever, triple varsity athlete in high school who pitched a no-hitter in college, and so, his dad wanted him to be a professional athlete and said, quit this stupid music shit. And, his wife wanted him to quit, his, now ex-wife, his first wife, who he fell in love with in college and had 2 children with. She really wanted him to quit music around the time he was recording his 5th album. And he promised her, if nothing happens with this album, I'll quit. And the 5th album was the one, Propeller, where he got a little record deal and started to do a little bit of touring, but it was really the 7th album, B-1000, that got him a bigger record deal with Matador. And then the albums B-1000 and Alien Lanes both sold 150,000 copies, which actually made him an indie rock household name. He still had no hits. He's never had a hit. That's another incredible thing about this guy. He's got 110 albums, never had a hit, but had songs that came close. He had a song called Hold On Hope off the album Do the Collapse that was almost a hit, and a song called Glad Girls off the album Isolation Drills that was almost a hit, that got played on the radio but just didn't make it, even though they're great pop songs. And he's kind of an indie rock, really. He's great with melody, incredible melodies, incredible choruses.
But he's still active today.
Still active.
Yeah, so he's one. Okay, so he's one of the good endings.
Very happy ending. He's one of only 2 artists in the book who's still going. He's 65 years old. He put out one of my 2 or 3 favorite albums so far this year called La La Land, Guided by Voices, La La Land. I wouldn't tell anyone that that's the first album of his you should listen to, but if it was the first album you listen to, I think any rock fan could listen to that album and go, oh, this is good. Is it great? I think he's got much greater albums, but La La Land is very good. It's a very good rock album, and actually easier to get into than some of his other albums, maybe. But and he's got another album coming out next month. And then the band Drive By Truckers that Jason Isbell started in, who you've probably heard of.
Heard of them.
Patterson Hood and Mike Cooley actually founded that band. Jason Isbell became the third songwriter in that band in the 2000s. They have like 15 albums out and are still recording and touring and are amazing. They're the last chapter in my book.
Well, we've only covered just a little bit of this book. There are 10 artists in all, so people can get the book. Great reviews on Amazon. It's out now through Amazon, all the usual places. And where can people find you online, Matt?
On Instagram at Matt Berenson Producer. And I also write a Substack called Matt Berenson's Newsletter for Music Obsessives. I was going to I was going to tie it to the book by calling it, Secret Stars Newsletter. I don't know, Secret Stars. But I decided that I didn't want to only write about artists like that in my newsletter, although as it turns out, about 80% of my newsletters are about artists like the ones I chose for Secret Stars. But, I've written about The Clash. I've written about a lot of, bigger artists on my newsletter as well. But yes, that's where I can be found.
Matt, thanks so much. This was great. I loved having this discussion, and I could do a whole episode on just the films that you've been involved in. We could talk movies for hours.
Well, thank you, Eric. And I'd be happy to do that anytime. You ever want to talk movies, we could do a separate podcast about movies. It's a crazy business, but
rock and roll and movies, boy, they work very well together.
Yes, indeed they do. There's nothing more fun than marrying music to film than when you're in post looking at your film and there's a scene that's not working, and then you find a song or a piece of score that works, and suddenly the scene is working the way it should, but it wasn't because it had the wrong music with it. It's amazing how much difference, having the right music or the wrong music in a scene makes.
Absolutely. And we got to thank Alan Berry too, because he's the one who hooked us up. How do you know Alan?
Alan and I have a film together. He made a fantastic documentary. This gives me a chance. It hasn't been made yet, but this is a perfect way to end it, I guess. He made a documentary called Dead Man's Line about a very unusual hostage crisis in Indianapolis in the 70s that became one of the first local crime events that became a nationwide news story, almost like OJ being followed in the Bronco or something. This was sort of like that. A disgruntled guy took a bank vice president hostage with something called a dead man's line, a wire around his neck that was connected to a loaded shotgun, and paraded him down the streets of right in downtown Indianapolis, stole a police car, drove him back to his apartment, and then held him hostage for 3 days in his apartment. And his apartment was wired with explosives. So the SWAT guys couldn't come in.
Man.
I mean, it's a really intense, amazing story.
That's out now? That documentary's out?
The documentary is available on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube, I'm pretty sure. And we got the rights to adapt it as a film. And by we, there's a writer-director named Robin Bissell who directed the Sam Rockwell, Taraji Henson movie I mentioned earlier, The Best of Enemies. He's going to be writing and directing this film. We do have an actor attached to play the hostage taker. I can't tell you who it is, though. That's has not been announced. But hopefully I'll be making that movie in 2024. All
right, Matt. Thanks, man. This was great.
Thank you, Eric. Much appreciated. This was fun.
That's it. It's in the books.